Thank you very much, Ton, and thank you also, David, for hosting this series in which I'm a devoted subscriber. It's absolutely wonderful. And my phone thinks that subscriber means Siri, so I just respond to that. I have looked forward to this opportunity for some time to speak to this group. I follow many of you, and I know many of you from the various Facebook groups that Ton and David are involved in, specifically the Sephardi diaspora, which is a spectacular resource and an inspiration, actually, to me, and a great resource. So I'm very happy to have you all on today. And I just want to mention that I haven't spoken in public in months. And I don't think I haven't spoken to more than 2 or 3 human beings a day in about 2 or 3 months. So I'm going to have to find my voice a little bit today. I'm going to turn this page. Many of you know this site. This is sort of a symbol of our project. It is the archaeological site in Megiddo, Israel, which is has been occupied for thousands of years, and to many of us is the symbol of continuity in the ancient lands that have become our promised land, our own land. And to Israelis, they know it well. And those of you who read the book, The Source by Mishner, 30 years ago, that's before Michael Waas was born, I think, my colleague, know that it has inspired many for centuries. It is of course, the site of the ultimate struggle between good and evil, which we know is Armageddon. So it's not just a Jewish site, it's a site that has captured the imagination of people all over the world. For us, it's the beginning point in our study of Jewish origins. It predates the Jewish people by thousands of years, but to us, it's a symbol because it stretches forward thousands of years into our time. So I'm going to now proceed. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about our project and about the subject matter, but let me just walk you through what we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss the origins of the Jewish people. We're going to just discuss our project and its aims. I'm going to go briefly through DNA basics. We're going to discuss some of the DNA patterns we found among the Sephardim and other non-Ashkenazi populations. We're going to discuss current initiatives, and then we're going to discuss, resources where you can learn about and follow on what we're doing. I have to apologize in the beginning. Giving a talk about DNA is sort of like the 3 bears. I don't know if you know that story in Europe, but I can be too detailed for some people and not detailed enough for some people. I have to find somewhere in the middle. So if I lose any of you during the talk, please ask questions during the Q&A. We'll do our best to
Adam,
yeah.
Can you speak louder or closer to the microphone?
Yeah.
Because
Yes. How's this better now?
Yeah. Okay.
If not, I can go in and adjust it. So this has absolutely nothing to do with our project, but it has something to do with our project, which is those of you can recognize what we're looking at in terms of what this is a map of. It is the map of the countries with the largest oil reserves at the present time in the world. And those of you who follow these things, you will recognize the Nimitz and the multinational task force following behind it in the Persian Gulf. And what this slide describes to me is the significance of oil, okay, in the world we live in. I don't think the 20th century history would be anything like it was without the security of oil being first in the minds of all nations in the world, okay? With that secure access to its markets, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Libya, and Russia would fold overnight, okay? They all depend upon oil to fund their economies. And on the other hand, the great consumers, Western Europe, China, and the United States, their industry would fold overnight without access to the international flow of oil. So just so you understand, this is not the first time this phenomenon has occurred in world history. I'm going to take you back 3,200 years, 3,400 years to the late Bronze Age. Now, the bronze was well, I would call it the petroleum of its day. It was an essential component of a society, of a growing, economically successful society, used in tools and, even more importantly, instruments of war. And you will note from this map the areas in blue that I'm marking with my cursor. Can you see my cursor, Todd?
Yes.
Okay. Areas in blue are areas where copper was freely found. And the areas in yellow are locations where tin was mined. And one of the essential aspects of bronze is it's an alloy of tin and copper. Copper alone didn't do the job, and tin alone did not do the job. The two of them were essential components. And to do that, a security regime was needed to assure access to these resources by the nations that were highly developed. And there you have a vessel of that period, probably the aircraft carrier of its day, that was used by the great powers to secure that access. Now, one of the things that, one of the attributes of that period is, much like we have alliances today to ensure our access to oil, and we may have our issues with the Russians and the Chinese, but when it comes to oil, we have no disagreements. Okay, we all need access to it, and we're all in agreement that the Persian Gulf is no place to work out our problems. So the same applied here. You had four great civilizations that needed access to bronze, and meaning it needed access to the components of bronze. They were the Egyptian Empire in the south, the Assyrians in the east, the Hittites in Anatolia, and the Mycenaeans to the west. Now, these may sound like dull historical material to you, but I assure you, you know all about these people, you just don't know it. During this period in Egypt lived Akhenaten. Okay, many of you know about Akhenaten and his interest in monotheism, which was potentially influential to the later Jewish people. And you know about the counter-revolution to his regime by this young fellow, Tutankhamun. And you know about Ramses II, who came a couple of pharaohs later, who was there present in Egypt at one of its high points in its civilization. What folks don't know, which is sobering for all of us who live in this interdependent world today, is that the whole thing came crashing down, the whole system, around 1200 BC. And there's just a great deal of discussion on the causes for this collapse of this state of affairs, but there are several. One is the possibility of environmental change, drought. The other is the possibility of accumulation of inconsistencies within the governments of each country. You know, empires only last so long, they have the seeds of their own destruction sowed in them. And the other is pressure from a group of migrant sea peoples who came down from Greece and began probing the cities of these various empires. And you can see this map shows the invasions of the sea peoples during this period. You can see the names of these famous cities of which many of us are aware: Aleppo, Kadesh, Byblos, Tyre, right, Ashkelon. And we have some evidence of their existence today. There was a very interesting study published earlier this year on a DNA study of the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians appear to have been a representative of these sea peoples who, for one reason or another, took possession of a strip of coastland in the Levant that today we know is the region of Gaza and Ashkelon. So this is a very interesting subject, and I won't dwell on it, but what's important about it is that when this system of these four empires collapsed, it established a vacuum, a power vacuum, much similar in my mind to what occurred in Yugoslavia after it collapsed. All right, from this overbearing Yugoslavian regime, you ended up with little states like Croatia and Slovenia, Bosnia, Macedonia, Kosovo, right, Serbia. So there was a collapse, and all these little nation states rose to the fore. And an analogous case might be made that this is what occurred following the collapse of the late Bronze Age system, in which 4 kingdoms ruled hundreds of little principalities and tribes. And among those are ones we are very familiar with. So after the collapse of the Bronze Age, we see a kingdom of Israel arise, or the people of Israel. We see Judah. We see Ammon and Moab and Edom, right? And the Philistines. So we know these from the Bible. And what you didn't know is perhaps that it was the collapse of the late Bronze Age that made this Jewish nationhood or Israelite nationhood possible. The first evidence we have of Jewish nationhood is a collection of monuments, granite monuments that we've found in various places in the Middle East. I only included one here too, which was a victory lap by Pharaoh Renepta, who talked about a overcoming resistance in Canaan 3,200 years ago, 1,200 years before present. And he refers to Ashkelon, Gezer, and that Israel is laid waste and his seed is not. And it's the first mention of a people in Canaan called Israel. So I'm going to just leave it at that. But that's our first archaeological evidence, hard archaeological evidence to the fact that a people arose called Israel. And there's other monuments of that period that refer to Yahweh, and there are other monuments that refer to Omri and to the house of David. So we have plenty of evidence that this is the beginning time of some self-identification associated with names that were very familiar, that were later used in the crafting of the Bible. Following the establishment of nationhood, we know from the Bible that there were various invasions. You know about most of them. This is the Assyrian invasion, Sennacherib. Then this is slightly out of order. That's actually Cyrus. This is Nebuchadnezzar, Alexander the Great, and ultimately Titus. Now, I end with the Romans because to the mind of Jewish genetics, basically our analysis is that the Roman Empire comprised probably 99% of the Jewish people at the time. And so our universe for studying the Jewish people is pretty much focused on the confines of the Roman Empire, which led all the way from Babylon in the east, all right, Tigris and Euphrates, all the way to what is today Morocco and Portugal, up to northern France and England to the west. Now, our question is, where are these people now? Okay, how can modern technology offer us some help in understanding the history of the Jewish people, its origins and its migrations? So we ask ourselves, where are the Jewish people of the Roman Empire today? Who were they? What happened to the Jews of Babylon, those who remained? Okay, we know that the Talmudic scholars remained. Okay, we know about the Talmud Bavli. Where are they today? Okay, there are many folks in the world today who have traditions of descent from the Babylon Jews, including the Persian Jews and Jews of Bukhara have a very strong tradition of descent from the Babylon Jews. The Jews of Rome, okay, the Jews of Judea conquered by Rome, where are they today? The Jews of Iberia and those who are in Iberia, where are they today? Okay, these are the kinds of questions we're asking. The Jews of Morocco, okay, which ones are native to North Africa, the Musta'arabim, and which ones are exiled from Spain? Okay, how do we parse that community? How do we understand about it? This is the community of Bukhara. Okay, they have various traditions from which they arose. One tradition is they're among the 10 lost tribes driven out by Assyria. Another tradition is they came up via Iraq from Babylon. And another tradition is they were part of the Silk Road Empire that ran from east to west, from China to Spain. So who are the Bukhari people? Where do they come from? This is the Aleppo Jews. Okay, we have the same issues. We have the Mustarabi. We have the Sephardim, who came from Spain. We have Ashkenazim, who came to Aleppo. We have Romaniot, who came from Aleppo. Who are they? How do we understand this community and its origins? So if you're going to undertake a study, it always pays to go to the people who are the best. And the godfather of Jewish genetics is a man named Dr. Karl Skoretsky, who is a nephrologist by training and a geneticist by inclination. He happens to run a major hospital right now in Israel, in Tiberias. And we spoke with Karl first. This is about 5 years ago. We had started an Ashkenazi project 20 years ago. But to answer these questions that I posed to you, we really needed to cast our web much more widely into the non-Ashkenazi world. And that has been our focus for the last 4 years. So we met with Karl, we discussed it extensively. And the first thing we decided to do was bring in reinforcements and to build a team. And this is the beginnings of our team. That's Harry Oster in the upper left-hand corner. He is a world expert on Jewish genetic diseases. Everything we're trying to accomplish, he's understood for the last generation. What makes a difference is that his understanding was based on people who had diseases. So we had a pretty firm idea of if you had Tay-Sex, when you lived with other people at Tay-Sex, when the common ancestor was of all Tay-Sex Ashkenazi patients. We had an understanding of that, but we didn't have an understanding of how can we test and how can we make those determinations about all of us, okay? Not just people with diseases. How do we carry through that concept of understanding migrations through simple, commercially available DNA testing? Down here, I have Michael Waas, who's present on this call, who is an archaeologist living in Haifa. Inish Nagero, who is a geneticist and expert in Sephardi Jews, who is herself a Sephardi descendant, living in Portugal, and Wim Penix, who is a biostatistician. I don't think there's a more valuable profession in the entire field right now. Archaeologists and geneticists and administrators come and go, but biostatisticians are made by God only. So a very valuable part of the team. So we sat down and we carved out a study. Now, one of the essential elements of a scientific study is you have to have a hypothesis. And our hypothesis was if we do a genetic study of Jewish men from the non-Ashkenazi communities, we will learn a great deal about the history of the Jewish people. And so that was our thesis. The next thing we had to do is one of the aspects of doing work on human beings is there's something called the Helsinki Protocol, which requires a process, institutional process for anyone doing studies on living human beings. So we're most definitely doing studies on living human beings, and we obtained what are called IRB approvals from 3 universities, the Technion Rambam in Israel, the University of Haifa, and NYU Winthrop, which was arranged by Aron Pinchasov and Daniel Shimonov from NYU, who were probably on this call. So the next thing we had to decide is who is it we want to test. So we sat down with experts in world Jewry, and we identified a series of locations where we think we needed to test. You'll see them on this map. They run everywhere from Bukhara all the way to the New World. And I think we identified roughly 40 or so different communities we needed help with. You can imagine that folks have privacy concerns associated with DNA testing. And we knew we would need people in each community to work with us. So to put their communities at ease that we had a project that was legitimate and that would be respectful of their needs. So we put together a team. These are only a small number of the men and women on our team. Some of them are actually a good number of them are on this call, starting with Tan and Elaine Farhi, who's on the call, and I'm running all the way up in the upper left-hand corner. There's Ainsley Cohn Enriquez and Sandy Demarchena and Rachel Levy Toldano and Ike Azo. So it's a group that basically covers, including ones you're not seeing on the screen, every Jewish community in the world, including Kaifeng, China. And the process is very simple. We basically put together a consent form, a protocol, a instruction sheet, return envelope, swabs, and 2 vials, okay? And then when you sign on to our project, that's what you get in the mail. And when you return it, we send you an envelope and a consent form. But one of the things I want to make clear is if you see in the lower right-hand corner, the 2 swabs, this is all the lab sees. Okay, people have asked me about how do I ensure the privacy of our participants. The lab has no idea who you are. Okay, so I know who you are, but I don't have access to your raw data. And the lab has access to your raw data, but they don't know who you are. So we have a complete division of responsibility, and we keep nothing on the internet. So the privacy and integrity of our project is paramount, particularly given the reputations of the people who are involved in it. Now, how did we decide what to study? There are many ways of approaching genetics of human beings, and I'll discuss the 3 flavors of genealogical investigation that are useful. Starting from the left, this blue arrow, this is the Y chromosome passed on from father to son. And that Y chromosome, due to recent improvements in technology, we have the ability to look at 7 million locations on that Y chromosome. Okay, so that we have room for 7 million variations. Now, one of the things you're looking for in DNA studies is no 2 people are exactly alike. Okay, and no 2 brothers are exactly alike, and not even identical twins are completely exactly alike, notwithstanding people's feelings on that or knowledge of that. Then there's a second type of DNA inherited by children from their mother, which is called mitochondrial DNA. That's 16,000 markers. So here we have 7 million markers. Here we have 16,000 markers. The last type of DNA we look at is called autosomal DNA, and that's not inherited just from your father's father's father or your mother's mother's mother. That's inherited from all of your ancestors. And there we look at 250,000 markers. Briefly, the problem with autosomal for our purposes is that it's like a deck of cards that gets shuffled in every generation. So you have 50% of each of your parents, roughly, 25% of each of your grandparents, 12.5% of your great-grandparents, 6% of your great-great-grandparents. I think you're getting the idea. Once you go back more than 4 or 5 generations, there's not enough material to really make a definite pronouncement about whether you're connected to another person or another family or community. So that is a very interesting, useful genealogical tool for population studies, for one, and it's very useful for things like Holocaust research, trying to reunite families. It's very good for finding adoptive parents or adoptive children. So it's exceptional for that, but not good for a long-term study of the Jewish people. The mitochondrial DNA is also very useful and very interesting, but it wasn't as useful for our purposes because with only 16,000 markers, there aren't enough variations for us to be able to truly understand the timing and branching of ancestry. And we'll get to that in a second to explain that to you. But if you look at the Y-DNA with its 7 million markers, that's exactly where we want to be. There we have a great deal of specificity for finding out when and where events in Jewish history occurred. So here's the Y chromosome. I referred to you. It's a living fossil. Now, one of the things I want to mention to you about DNA is that DNA basically offers you a evidence, genealogical evidence of the history of life on Earth back to its very beginning. I can't emphasize that enough. One of the first things I learned 40 years ago when we started doing cancer research in Israel was that there's a section of the yeast genome which is identical to the section in the human genome. So that and their common ancestor must have lived billions of years ago. So the question is, what's so essential about that aspect of the genome that it's been preserved for billions of years, such that yeast and human beings both share it? So that's an important question, but less important for this purpose than to understand that that the human genome is an enormous encyclopedia with many mysteries of life included in it. We have selected one small mystery of life, which is the history of the Jewish people, which is our focus. Now, I want to discuss with you genetic variations and the timing of genetic variations. This is an example of a Y chromosome genealogical study. You will see here two brothers, okay, one on the left and one on the right. One brother has one son, who has one son, who has one son, who has a son with a genetic variation. Well, this is exactly what we'd expect to find, because out of the 7 million markers of the Y chromosome, which I described a second ago, there should be one variation out of those 7 million roughly every 4 generations, 140 years. Okay, but it's really not based on time, it's based on births. Basically, you should see a mutation every 4 male births. So here you have 4 to 5 generations, which should be 120 to 150 years. But here's a brother who had 5 sons. Okay, so using the same principle of 1 mutation versus 5 births, this person who had 1 son per generation waited 150 years to see a mutation. This brother saw a mutation in the 1st generation. And what does this mean? It means that if we see a large number of mutations occurring in 1 generation in a community, it suggests to us that those men were having a lot of sons, meaning that there was some kind of population, very rapid population explosion occurring in that community. This is a very important principle in history. We see it in genetic diseases, and now we're seeing it in the Y chromosome. So here's another example of variations. You can see that a variation inherited by this one son carried on through to all his descendants. So if I'm trying to figure out whether a person is a descendant of this brother or this brother, if I know that this brother passed this on to his descendants and I have it, I'm part of this family. If I don't have this variation shared by the descendants of this man, then I must be part of his brother's family. This is very simplistic terms, but this principle applies to all human beings, whether it's a tribe, whether it's a nation, or whether it's an immediate family. The principle is we're looking for variations. And by understanding the variations between people, we can say whether you belong in this group or that group. Okay? So here is a genetic tree of my lineage. And what distinguishes this tree is that each one of these boxes represents a new variation in the Y chromosome. Okay? This happens to be a Y chromosome that became Jewish in Iberia. Everybody at the top of this page lives in England. Everybody from here down lived in Iberia. It then split. These fellows are in Portugal and Brazil. These men are all Jewish. These fellows are Ashkenazi. This group split into a Sephardi group and an Ashkenazi group. So we're clearly being able to see here when how these communities evolved by looking at the variations in their Y chromosome that some communities shared or some lineages shared and some did not. So here is a marker, a variation of Y chromosome, which the scientists call RA689. We know that everybody who has R689 descended from that man. We know that everyone who does not have that variation descended from a different branch of the family. So we have of the 7 million locations we're looking at in the Y chromosome, in 4 years of testing, the scientists have identified 1 million variations on the Y chromosome, which is an astonishing number. We now have the ability to know a great deal about an individual by looking at his Y chromosome, down to a granularity of about 80 years ago. So it's quite an astonishing result. We look back in time to the time of, well, back to 60,000 years ago, and we've been able to use this technology to understand the migrations of the human race over in prehistory. Okay, I won't get too deeply into this. This is the migration of the Native Americans, right? The Siberians into the North and South America. This is the Aboriginal group, 50,000 years ago, going into Australia. It all begins in Africa, of course, and the different migrations around the world. We're not going to get into this right now. This is certainly worth examining if you want to get an understanding of the history of humanity. Now, what did we learn from our DNA testing? Well, the first thing I want to point out is we learned that the Jewish community, from a Y chromosome standpoint, that is from a male standpoint, is exceptionally diverse. We have found not one Abraham in our story, not one founding male in our community, but we've found over 600 such males in our community. This is something that should come to no surprise to any of us. We knew from even our earliest documents, the Torah, tell us that when they understood, whether they understood the history exactly or not, they understood the concept, which was when the Jewish people were founded, Moses didn't leave Egypt, the traditional Egypt, with the sons of Jacob. He also left with the mixed multitudes, meaning that even in our early history, the Israelites understood that they were not a nation of descendants from one man, they were descendants of many men. And our Y chromosome study has proven that. You can go to our website hosted by Wim Penix at jewishdna.net, and you will find there an exhaustive catalog of Jewish Y chromosomes that we have discovered thus far. And I say thus far because in many communities, we have just begun to scratch the surface. So that is not true in the Ashkenazi community. In the Ashkenazi community, we have thousands of men. We fully understand the origins of Ashkenazi men, but we don't. We're not finding new lineages, new founding lineages when we test them. But when we test a community like Morocco or the Bukharan or in Tunisia, half of all men we test represented a lineage. So when 50% of the people are brand new, then that means for sure you haven't tested enough. Okay, so we're going to continue going until we feel we've exhausted it. But I expect that when we're done, we're going to be well over 1,000, perhaps thousands of Jewish male ancestors. So here is a simple finding of the 600 men we have found roughly 90 to 100 Ashkenazi and over 500 non-Ashkenazi. Meaning even though the Ashkenazi today are the overwhelming share of the Jewish population, that's far from the truth. Okay, the actual truth is that in terms of prior to 850 AD or 800 AD and the founding of the Ashkenazi population, likely that the overwhelming share of the Jews worldwide were non-Ashkenazi. Just want to show you an example I discussed with you a moment ago about how when we find a lot of variations in one generation, it suggests that there was a massive population increase. Here is another view of my lineage, and I don't do this out of ego. I do this because no one's going to yell at me for violating their privacy when I use my own data. But you can see here, we have clearly demonstrated, you can clearly see from the data, these founding events. So here is a founding event that occurred 1,400 years ago, in which this whole lineage fractured. So this represents the descendants of one man up here at the top, this dark blue bar. And we see a fracturing of his lineage into two lineages. And then look at this, we have him fracturing into 3 lineages, and then an additional fracturing into 6 lineages, and an additional fracturing into 4 lineages. So what we're seeing here are these profound events that occurred at various times in Jewish history, where we see these sudden community. And we think we have a pretty handle on this. We believe that when you look back 1,200 years, we're seeing the settlement of the Jews of the Mediterranean, or a certain percentage of the Jews of the Mediterranean settling in southern France and in southern Germany, either through Italy and or the Rhone River. We think when we look here at 1400 CE, we think we're looking at a major expansion event in Eastern Europe that accompanied the settlement of Jews in Poland and Lithuania at the invitation of Casimir. So we're seeing what I would call here a Charlemagne effect and a Casimir effect associated with what we known to have been major periods of Jewish history and immense demographic success for the Jewish people. This is a we see various entry points into the Ashkenazi population. And I don't bring this up for the sake of demonstrating anything other than the fact that the Ashkenazi population are simply a subset of the non-Ashkenazi population that lives in the non-Ashkenazi Jewish world to this day. Okay, it's not a separate people, didn't come from Khazaria, it didn't come from Cossacks attacking Jewish women. These were simply a portion of the pre-existing Roman and Byzantine Jewish world of men who went up the Rhone River and over the Alps and up along and later on up through the Ottoman Empire, the invitation of Suleiman, after there was the Ottomans conquered southeastern Europe. This was simply a migration by a population that we all know today. What distinguished them was that they traveled beyond lines of communication. They went so far up the Rhone that they lost access to the Mediterranean, and they developed their own language and their own traditions, right? And that's pretty much what we're seeing today. Now, I'm going to go back a step. Michael Waas is on this call. Michael did a magnificent study with several other geneticists and historians, Doron Jacobi, Leon Kull, and others. Wim Penix was a major part of this. And he studied a population that dates back to a group of men who lived during the Bronze Age. And if you take a look at this chart, the blue area, it looks a great deal like the chart I showed you a minute ago. You see the branching, contemporaneous branching of different lineages. You got all the way from the left to the right. You can see it's a rather collapsed period of time, roughly 3,500 years ago when this all took place. The green line represents the Bronze Age, roughly the Bronze Age collapse. And you'll notice—
Adam,
yeah.
Can you explain what collapse means?
Yes, well, I referred earlier at the beginning of this, how the four empires all collapsed rather suddenly in 1200 BC.
Mm-hmm.
The period during the late Bronze Age was a period of enormous demographic success. Okay, those four nations ruled the Eastern Mediterranean, and the great temple of Karnak, the temples of the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the fantastic Mycenaean temples, these all occurred, this tremendous wealth all occurred during the late Bronze Age. And it was accompanied by economic and demographic success by the populations who lived in that region. And I mentioned to you earlier that 1200 BC, 3200 years ago, that whole system collapsed. And what the archaeologists think is that not only did it collapse, it was accompanied by a population decline in the Middle East. And you'll notice here, when you look at these Bronze Age lineages, we've tested dozens of men in these lineages, you will notice that there's no more branching for the next 2,000 years. Okay? No branching at all. These dotted lines, Michael can talk about this further during Q&A, but these dotted lines all represent the absence of actually a demographic decline. And then what's interesting is we look down at the bottom, and you'll see the lettering is small, so I'll read it for you. Armenian, New Christians, Arabs, Turks, Sardinians, Germans, Iberians, Arabs, Kuwaitis. We also have Ashkenazim, and we have a Sephardim in this chart. And since this chart was prepared, Michael and his team have found an additional Sephardi group. And I think the ultimate takeaway from this is that just like the Ashkenazim arose out of a pre-existing non-Ashkenazi Mediterranean Jewish population, the Jewish people arose out of a very diverse Bronze Age population that existed in the Middle East before the destruction of the great empires and the rising of the Israelites. So what we're saying is the Israelites were part of the background population, arose from the background population of the Middle East. And we are largely indistinguishable prior to the Bronze Age collapse and the rising of the Jewish people from all the other populations of the Middle East. We are people of the Middle East, going back thousands of years. Okay, this is incontrovertible.
Thank you.
Now I want to show you a second interesting finding. So the question would be, if we were to find a Judean lineage, okay, I just showed you what a Bronze Age lineage looked like. If we were to find a Judean lineage, what would it look like? Well, we just happen to have one. We've tested several dozen men around the world who have a tradition of common ancestry, and we find them in Yemen. We find them in Afghanistan. We find them in the Caucasus, Morocco, Spain, Ashkenazim. We found them basically throughout, and their common ancestor lived between 1500 and 3100 years ago. I'm sorry, 2500 and 3100 years ago, meaning they lived unquestionably in temple times. And we know that dating within 95% confidence. So here we have a group of individuals with common ancestry, whose common ancestor, the only thing they have in common is a group of common ancestors who lived 2500 to 3100 years ago. So if they need proof positive of the Judean ancestry of the Jewish people, this is the first of what we expect will be many examples of this pattern. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Sephardi. Since this is a Sephardi group, I suppose I should talk a little bit about it. We have found very interesting things. We've used the same methodology we used for studying the Bronze Age and for studying the pattern of migration out of Judea. We've used for understanding the patterns of migration out of Iberia. You know, as there are people on this call far more versed in this than I, but we have strong evidence that the beginning of the end for the Jews of Iberia was roughly 1391, and that Jews began trickling out long before the expulsion and wandering to far and wide. Okay, so here's one lineage we found. We found it in the New World. We found it in Amsterdam, and we found it in Aleppo, Syria. Just giving you some examples. Here's a second lineage we found in Curacao, Suriname, Hamburg. What else did we find it here? I can't see the page.
Is there one family name attached to these lineages, or are
There is.
more?
There is. For reasons of privacy, I can't describe them right now.
Okay.
I will tell you that none of the surnames match in these studies. This particular study, we have done surname studies of some very well-known families. I think I can mention that. And we've studied Al-Hadef family and the Russo family. These are well-known Romaniote community families, and we find that wherever we find those families in the Mediterranean, they're the same family. But the names, the families that come from Iberia, we're not finding that because of the simple fact that they probably didn't have surnames before the adoption, or sustainable surnames before the adoption of the Christian names that they picked up as new Christians, you know, in Portugal.
Mm-hmm.
Oops, excuse me, I just lost my page here. Here's a third one, very interesting lineage. We have found it in Greece, Mexico, Curacao, Italy, and Amsterdam.
If I may, Adam, we don't
sir.
see it. I don't see it.
Okay, then no one's seeing it. Let's see what's going on.
Press share screen.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to go back and try that again.
Mm-hmm.
One second, I apologize.
Oh, it's okay. Yes, that works.
Without a 15-year-old kid here, I'm hopeless. Now, I want to mention to you as I go through these, we do have information on most of these, and we're happy to answer emails and phone calls and WhatsApp calls, and to discuss these matters in detail with participants. So while I can't discuss them in a talk that's being broadcast over the internet and Facebook and put online, we can discuss in some detail these matters offline with individuals. Okay, I just want to make that point. In answer to your question, Tom. Here's a third example. We're seeing this lineage, clearly Iberian, Jewish, Greece, Mexico, Curacao, Italy, and Amsterdam. I will tell you, if we mention the names of these different lineages, you would know them immediately. And I would also mention that this particular lineage is a very large Ashkenazi lineage, one we're looking at here. And I didn't show that here, but one of the things we have tried to do in the course of our study is try to demonstrate where the Ashkenazi lineages came from when we can. So this is one I think we're going to have a pretty good handle on, because this AB 59 is in parallel to a major Ashkenazi lineage. And I think we're going to ultimately find how that came into that population. My suspicion is it came in up through Turkey, through the Ottomans, because it seems to predominate along the eastern edge of the Ashkenazi territory. Here's another one we found in Portugal, Morocco, Amsterdam, Salonika. Okay, you guys see a pattern here? There are many, many like this. I'm just giving you the tip of the iceberg. Here's another one: New World, Spain, Morocco, Tunisia, Balkans, and Turkey. Again, all names you've all heard of. Now, the ones I've mentioned up to now are basically lineages that come out of Judea, okay, or the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean. We know that because we know the history before they were Jewish. We know that they're Eastern Mediterranean lineages. But that doesn't mean we're only finding them, because the Jewish people lived in Iberia for roughly 1,500 years in any size. And it's perfectly, and since we know that in early Roman times, there was a degree of fluidity of identity in the Roman Empire between Jews and non-Jews, it wouldn't surprise us to find that there's a degree of Y chromosomes that found their way into the Jewish population along the way. Now, one particular Y chromosome lineage, which is 4,500 years old, is called DF27. I don't expect you to memorize that, but the map is rather clear that this is a lineage that comes from Spain. Okay, the red is the hot spot that describes where both of them live, and it gets colder and colder until it reaches the blue point. And you can see this is almost an exclusively Iberian, and maybe just across the Pyrenees into Western France. But certainly it didn't come out of Judea. And here's an example of a lineage, a Jewish lineage that descended from that Spanish or that Iberian DF27 Y chromosome. And you can see where we find it. We find it in Portugal, and we find it in Italy, among a very well-known old Italian lineage. And we also find it directly north from Turkey, all the way up to Lithuania. And it's a major Ashkenazi lineage. So as I mentioned to you, we not only learn about the Sephardim by testing them, we also learn something about the origins of the Ashkenazi. And these Sephardi lineages are clearly upstream of the Ashkenazi lineages, so we know how this Sephardi lineage, how this Iberian lineage came to Russia and Poland and Lithuania. We do not know, or not yet convinced, that it is a Sephardi lineage. And by that, I mean, we're not yet convinced it came to Eastern Europe after the schism between Ashkenazi and Sephardi populations, or identity. It's perfectly possible that this lineage came to Eastern Europe before there was such a thing as a Sephardi culture. Okay, when it was perhaps 1,500 years ago, when it was, or 1,200 years ago, when it was simply a Mediterranean culture. So this is something we're exploring. Now, I want to talk to you a little about the projects we're doing, or that we're associated with. One is a project being done by this young woman, Ines Nogueira, who is a geneticist at University of Porto in Portugal, who has documentation of descent from Converso Jews 500 years ago in Portugal. And she has undertaken a study of 150 individuals who live in the lands along the border between Portugal and Spain, called the Raya. And Michael and I visited this area a number of years ago. We did some testing in there, and indeed we found incontrovertible Y chromosome evidence that these families have been continuously Jewish during this entire period, at least along the Y chromosome. And Ines has a much more expansive project in the works in which she's going to look at a very substantial percentage of the population. She has the benefit of A, being an expert on the subject, but B, being a Converso descendant herself. She has the ability to gain the trust of these communities who are rather insular, and to sample them. So we're looking forward to working with her on that subject. Second project we're working with is with a physician named Emily Warschauer. And Emily approached us 2 years ago because she and her colleagues at the University of Colorado had discovered a disease in communities in Mexico and Colorado and southern New Mexico that they couldn't understand. And could we make any heads or tails of it? And we did a autosomal study of those two communities of the individuals who had that particular disease. And we found that it was like a bullseye on two well-known areas of Jewish settlement several hundred years ago, both in New Mexico and in Mexico. So we believe that this is the first time, I think, where we've been able to work backwards to use a genetic disease to find a previously hidden population. I'm sure my friend Harry Oster will correct me on that, because he's done a great deal of work in both Mexico and in Peru. But I believe this is the first time this has ever been done using commercially available consumer testing. Another project we're working on is a study with Doron, who I mentioned to you earlier in connection with Michael's study of the Bronze Age. He is doing a study of, or he's working with a team in Israel that has been looking at archaeogenetics, that is the study of DNA from ancient remains. You may have read articles recently that were published on the history of, actually the study of the remains found in northern Israel from the Bronze Age, and also a study of remains found during the Copper Age, which is beyond 5,000 years ago. And they found a great deal of affinity between modern Jewish populations and other populations of the Middle East, and the populations of ancient times. So we have a great deal of interest in this. We have another young scientist named Eli Bashan, who is also working on this project. And I think we're just scratching the surface of this particular area of study. Another project we're working on right now, we started the past month. Rochelle Levy Toledano is working with us through her Facebook group. She's also working with Nathaniel Farouz and others to develop a study of the Moroccans. And that's joining in with Mark Fellis, who has been studying the Tunisians, to get an understanding of the populations of that community. And there we're doing both a Y-DNA test and we're doing an autosomal test. And why is this historically important? Well, we have very few reliable records in the last century of the Moroccan population. And we're going to see if Moroccan men we can start to will help us provide what the records can't provide. So this is a rapidly growing project, and this is a wonderful website, and I encourage any of you with an interest in Sephardi research to look at it. I have no doubt among the first 100 men we've tested out of Morocco, we're going to find dozens who match up with individuals we have found in other parts of the Sephardi world. This is the future. So we're now wrap this up by talking about the future of genetic genealogy. At the beginning or halfway through this talk, I described to you that we look at Y-DNA testing, and we do mitochondrial DNA testing, and we do autosomal DNA testing. Recent developments in DNA testing and recent dramatic reductions in price. What? I'm going to mute that for a second, Ton.
Sorry?
Mute for a second and I'll keep going. Okay.
Yeah. Keep
So
going.
we're on. So what we're seeing is a convergence now. So instead of testing a little bit of the Y and a little bit of the mitochondria and a little bit of the autosomal, we now have the ability to test your entire genome. Billions of locations on your genome. And what I think within a year or two, I think all of the DNA testing, which you've come to know, whether it's autosomal or big Y or mitochondrial, will go away and be supplanted by a whole genome sequence regime. Pricing today is unbelievable. The cost of a whole genome sequence, which shows every gene in your body, both medical and non-medical, is available for $299. It would have cost $100 million 20 years ago. Probably cost $100 million. Probably cost $1 million 10 years ago. Probably cost you $100,000 5 years ago. But $299 for a whole genome sequence. That is the future, and I think that it's going to completely change the landscape of DNA testing. This is the growth of our project in the last 5 years. I think we started with about 459 people. We now have approaching 9,000. So this is, I look forward to your questions. This is the website where we publish our propaganda and information about our project. We also have a Facebook page where we publish our results. We also frequently habituate the Sephardi diaspora website, frequently trolling for participants in our project, but also to answer questions from Sephardim. We also participate in a couple of other sites. One of them is Tracing the Tribe, hosted by Shelley Dardashti, which is a fantastic go-to resource for answering questions about genealogy, and the Jewish Genealogical Portal, which is hosted by Randy Schoenberg, which takes on a similar role. This is my page, and you're welcome to contact me or Michael Waas or Wim Penix or anyone referred to on our project page. And at that, I'm going to turn it over back to Tom.
Yes, thank you, Adam. Before I give the word to Michael Waas to answer questions, I have a question of my own. Are you still seeking new applicants for your project?
Absolutely. We currently have absolutely no limit on participants.
Are there any blanks in your research, places that you haven't got any participants from, or where you would expect more people to show up?
Very interesting question. We do not believe that we have any blanks in the Ashkenazi population, but based on the fact that we're still finding 50 new lineages among 50% of all the men we test in every community, every non-Ashkenazi community, whether it's Afghani to Caribbean, we are looking for participants in every single non-Ashkenazi community, whether it's Egypt, Libya, we're very interested in, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, you name it. The Italkim were badly undertested by the traditional Jews of Italy. We have a very good sample of the Jews of Greece and Rhodes, but we're always looking for more. We're undertested among the Jews of Aleppo and Damascus. We're very much we're very well tested in Curacao, thanks to Sandy Demarchena, but we're very bad. We're undertested in Jamaica, for example.
Okay.
So the answer to your question is we're not even close to having achieved our goals yet. Okay. Even after having tested 1,000 men.
Thank you. David, do you have a question?
I don't. I'm just looking. Obviously, there's a lot of people joining us on Facebook. So Holly on Facebook was asking where the best place to go for tests, DNA tests are, or indeed does it matter?
Well, we work with family tree DNA, and the simple reason for that is they offer Y chromosome testing and mitochondrial testing, and no one else does. So if you want to put your sample in a lab, and you have, even if you're doing autosomal DNA testing, if you want to put your sample in a lab where you have the freedom to do a mitochondrial test if you're a woman, or the freedom to do a Y or a mitochondrial test if you're a man, then family tree DNA is the place to go, in our opinion. That's the lab with whom we work. Okay. Now I want to mention another thing, which is we have a grant for non-Ashkenazi males. So we will fund entirely the cost of a Y chromosome test for non-Ashkenazi males if it represents a family we've never tested before. So we also subsidize Ashkenazi tests, but the full cost of a non-Ashkenazi male is borne by us. So that's certainly an incentive for people to participate.
Okay, Michael?
Adam, Shelley had a request if you could talk a little bit about the some of the Mizrahi Y lineages.
Okay. The Mizrahi Y lineages are also diverse, much like the lineages of the other Jewish community. But we haven't seen any pattern yet that would suggest anything to us. Now, I want to mention to you that when we find these ancient Judean lineages that clearly are 2,500 years old, we are finding them in Iraq as well as everywhere else. So I can't speak to the lineages, all the lineages, because in every Jewish community we've ever studied, we have found some degree of men, some portion of men who joined the Jewish community locally. Okay, we found this in every community, and of course we know it's occurring to this day. But that being said, when we find these kernels, these provable kernels of ancient Judean DNA from temple times, we're always finding it in Iraq, and whenever we find it anywhere else. So that's the point I would like to make, is that we have certainly found the ancient Iraqi connection, Babylonian connection to the temple.
Okay, while waiting for some more questions, if you do have questions, please type them. I will handle passing them along. I just wanted, while we wait for some of these questions, I just wanted to go back to Z640 and clarify something about the Jewish lineages we have there. One of the reasons why we're able to make a strong hypothesis as to the Bronze Age location being in the Levant is that we actually have 5 separate Jewish lineages that predate 3,200 years ago. So well before the accepted founding date of the Jewish people, approximately around the time of the Bronze Age collapse. And all four out of the 5 have Sephardic or Iberian relationship. And the 5th one is one of the 4 remaining Samaritan clans. So that was my clarification for everybody. So we have a question from Leslie about if we have any recommended reading.
That's a very good question. It depends on the subject you're interested in. The reading I'm doing at the moment, trying to understand the results we're seeing, is trying to grasp the relationship between Jews and the local populations, and trying to explain why at certain periods of time we're finding new Y chromosomes entering the Jewish population. I want to point out to you that for the most part, these events all occurred more than 1,500 years ago. We're not seeing any evidence whatsoever of a great deal of men joining the Jewish population since 500 AD. Everything seems to be before then. But I am trying to understand these early periods in Jewish history, particularly in Roman times and Byzantine times, to see, before the rise of the wall between Christianity and Judaism, what was going on in those populations, what help explains it. I'm particularly interested in Iberia, So I think you answered a very good asked a very good question, and I think, Michael, we should put together a reading list on this subject that we can make available. The first thing I would suggest you do is go to our website, Avotaynu Online, and read the articles that we've published. And there you'll find contact information for Michael and Wim and I, and we will certainly put together a reading list. I think it's a great idea. Thank you for that question, Leslie.
Next question we have is from Ruben. He's asking, I'm Ashkenazi, but I suspect I may be Sephardic. What should he do?
Well, it would depend upon how he thinks he's Ashkenazi. If you think that I'm Sephardi, excuse me. If you believe you're Sephardi through your Y chromosome, that is through a paternal lineage, that's something we can give you very quick results on, and rather firm results, because the Ashkenazi Y chromosomes and the Sephardi Y chromosomes don't differ 2,000 years ago, but they differ within the last 1,200 years, because the Ashkenazi chromosomes bear the clear evidence of massive population explosion in Central Europe and Eastern Europe at the time of Charlemagne or Casimir, but the Sephardi populations, which were constantly culled by disease, okay, and economic repression, never had that demographic success that the Ashkenazim had. So we can tell a Sephardi lineage right away. It doesn't show any of that expansion, the expansion events that the Ashkenazim enjoyed.
Great. Next question we have is from Charles, asking if the comparison between Ashkenazi and Sephardic endogamy, does it show up in DNA? Are both similar? Are they different?
The endogamy is similar within specific specific communities. So, for example, endogamy is going to typically show up in the last 200 to 300 years. You're not going to necessarily see evidence of it beyond that that's recognizable. In other words, you're not going to see people you know. You're going to see people, probably 10th cousins who look like 5th cousins. So you see it indirectly. But we see a tremendous amount of endogamy within specific communities. So within the Tunisian community, within the Moroccan community, okay, within the Aleppo community. So if you give me an autosomal test from Aleppo, we'll recognize it immediately, okay, because you'll be related to the Sits, okay, and the Careys, and the Gindis. I mean, we're going to see right off the bat that these are the families you've been marrying into for centuries. If you do the same thing in Curacao, we're going to see that the De Marchenas, okay, and the Pinedos, okay, and the Levi Maduros, these families have all been marrying each other again and again and again. So there's clear evidence of endogamy within each community. That being said, among the Ashkenazim, we don't see any evidence of that. The endogamy is widespread, clearly indicating that there was a great deal of mobility within the Ashkenazi community. When someone says that they have a way that they can prove exactly how the Ashkenazi migrated, I don't think it's remotely possible. We know from documentary evidence, and we see it from the DNA, that the Ashkenazim have been wandering around for centuries. An example, when DNA studies began about 20 years ago, they started a project called Hungarian Jewish DNA. Then they had German Jewish DNA. Then they had Lithuanian Jewish DNA, and they had Polish Jewish DNA. And we looked at all the results, and it was hopeless because they all had exactly the same Y chromosomes. Okay, we could not distinguish among them. So I'm open-minded on the subject. If we could find a way to do this, I would be delighted. But so far, I haven't seen it. Some are going to try, and I wish them all the best. But thus far, we've had no success at demonstrating that. So, the answer to your question is, endogamy is absolutely, certainly a feature of all Jewish populations worldwide. Great.
David has two questions for you, actually. One is, can you specifically talk about those populations that emerged in Iberia? What percentage of the total are they? And a question from Facebook is asking about testing among the Jews of Crete, especially the Romani family.
The first question I'm going to answer is the DF27 lineage, the Iberians. The DF27 lineage is the only one we have identified with certainty is Iberian in origin. And that lineage, we have roughly 20 examples of Jewish Y chromosomes from that lineage. That's 20 out of 600, which is a remarkably small percentage, given how long the Jewish population has been present in Iberia. This is not to say that we won't find that others are Iberian in origin. It's just the DF27 we have focused on because we know without doubt that this originated in Iberia. So there are other examples that we think may be Italian in origin, that may represent an equivalent, I won't call it conversion because there really was no conversion process in Roman times, but that kind of introgression where men from the pagan communities of Italy entered in the Jewish population. So if once we identify one of those lineages, we'll do the same kind of major tests we've done on the DF27 and see if we can identify within each population which population benefited from the attraction of new male lineages to the community. Now, the second part of the question about the Romani family, we have tested the Romani family of Libya. Now, I don't know if it's the same family or not. The well-known Libyan historian, Maurice Romani from Ben Gurion University of the Negev is one of our participants and a team member. The family from Crete, we have not tested, and I would be delighted to.
Great. Just a request to Jaime or Jamie, please rephrase your question. I don't understand it. The next question is from Mario. He's stating that he's new to genealogy research. He would like to know if my ancestors were either Sephardic or Ashkenazi, although he has no indication from his MyHeritage test that he has any Jewish ancestry. Based on those results, do you think he should keep researching down this line?
Absolutely. Let's talk about it. I think you should. I would go to our Avotaynu DNA page or the Sephardi diaspora page, and send us a message. And you can send it to Adam Brown or Michael Waas, and we'll look into it with you. It's too general a question, and I will mention to you that autosomal results are interesting, but not dispositive. We have plenty of people who we know absolutely from a Y chromosome standpoint come from Sephardi families, incontrovertibly. I mean, these are documented men who don't show an ounce of Jewish autosomal DNA. And on the other hand, I have men, Christians from Germany, who don't have an ounce of Jewish DNA, but who have uncontrovertibly have a Jewish Y chromosome. So there's it cuts in all directions, and so I wouldn't just base it on what you read on MyHeritage. There's a lot more to DNA than just that autosomal result, which loses its flavor on the bedpost after about 200 years.
Peggy is asking which company is offering whole genome testing currently?
One of them is called Dante, and the other one is called Nebula.
All right. Yeah, continue. Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
Nebula is run by a fellow named George Church, who is a well-known scientist at Harvard who invented something called CRISPR, which many of you may have heard of. I think probably in 10 years, he's going to be the wealthiest man in America. But in the meantime, he has applied his money to starting up this nebula, and the tests are typically $700. But right now, there's a very interesting and inexplicable marketing campaign where they're all selling them for 60% off. And I think it's definitely worth doing. I will mention to you that if you do a whole genome, if you're a male and you do a whole genome sequence, you have not only done your whole genome in terms of all the medical possibilities, you've also done a complete test of your Y chromosome that we can use in our studies. So that's so I recommend very highly the whole genome. I think that's the future.
All right, we have another question. Ian is asking if we see that there's a population bottleneck in the Sephardic population around the time of the expulsion, and if we can tell Sephardic and Ashkenazi DNA apart. I'll just briefly add that in Z640, we absolutely did see in some of them bottlenecking occurring, where the branching event occurred and then it was isolated around 600 years ago.
Yes, well, a lot of it has to do with the bottlenecking is a function of many things, but most likely oppression. Not everyone got to choose where they moved. And if they went from a community that was expansive and wealthy, as the Iberian community was for a good part of its history, into a community where it's impoverished, such as the mountain regions of Mexico and Guatemala and Honduras, where we are finding Sephardi families, you can expect that there will be a population bottleneck, because this is very largely a function of economic success. And we see the back end of the bottleneck when that population has an opportunity to expand. So when, there's two sides to a bottleneck. There's the reduction in the size of the population followed by an expansion of the population. So to have a bottleneck, though, you need to have a true bottleneck where you see both men going in and men coming out. You would need to see some degree of success at the far end. Michael, would you not, if you're going to expect to see any kind of population expansion?
Well, any population expansion, absolutely, but bottlenecking isn't always contingent on that, since it requires then that same population after the bottlenecking events have success. So we have a comment from Shemuel that he says, I casually researched Iraqi lineages. I have found from reading literature and history, there were two main periods of Baghdadi Jewry, circa 800 till Timur Lang in 1395, and then the return from 1480 Ottoman until 1980. 1395, most Jews escaped to Kurdistan, other areas in fear of Timur, although some Jews remained. In any case, second period comprised of Jews from Kurdistan that returned, Spain, Turkey, Halab, Persia, and Georgia and the Caucasus. So Baghdadi Jewry won't have one haplogroup. And that's a comment from Shemuel.
Thank you, Shmuel. We do see predominant lineages in Iraq and Persia, but to say that they all come from one lineage, we're not seeing that. One thing you said is absolutely true. We are seeing Iraqi commonality between Iraq and Kurdistan. From Baghdad and Kurdistan. We're also seeing Baghdad matches to men in the Caucasus. We're seeing matches to men in Turkey. So there is a degree of commonality. I also mentioned to you that we're also finding Iraqi matches to the Judean lineages from Old Testament or from temple times, from the early First Temple and Second Temple. So the answer is I can't answer that. We're also finding a very strong connection between Afghanistan and Iraq, and of course Persia and Iraq. So the jury is out yet. The answer, Samuel, is we haven't yet tested enough people to be definitive about it. Okay, I need 100 samples from each community to really feel I have an understanding of what's going on.
This ties in well to our next question coming from Shelley. Considering the limited number of Persian samples, what is the DNA support for the historical event of Persian Jews arriving in Old Persia around 2,700 years ago? As you know, her husband's lineage is from Isfahan. No info that they lived anywhere else.
Okay, so Shelley is referring to lineage R2, which is which we call, for those of you who follow such things, AB85. What's interesting about the Dardashti lineage is it is a cousin of a major lineage, Eastern European lineage. And so there was obviously some kind of connection 1,000 years ago between Persia and Eastern Europe that we haven't unraveled yet. We don't yet have anything over 1,100 years ago for that lineage. It doesn't say it doesn't exist. It's just that we haven't found it yet. So the answer to your question about temple times will be when I find a man somewhere in the world who matches the Dardashti Y chromosome and their common ancestor lived 2,500 years ago, and you'll be the first person I call, Shelley.
Great. We have a question from Bernard. My mother's Sephardic family is easily traceable back genealogically to Iberia before 1000. I was surprised to find genealogical evidence of my father's Ashkenazi family in southern France around 1100. Would you expect me to find traceable Sephardic DNA in my own testing?
Before 1100, is this a male or a female asked this question?
It's a man asking his mother's family and his father's family.
Okay, I don't think you would find any meaningful autosomal matches from 900 years ago. But if there's anyone in that family, if you think you have a paternal descent, a Y chromosome would certainly indicate whether or not this is an Iberian lineage or not. There was autosomal we can't. Mitochondrial, if there's a direct line in, father, mother, daughter, mother, daughter, mother, daughter. Y chromosome, certainly if it's a father, son descent, we would be able to tell, but in the absence of those two things, it would be very hard to prove something going back 1,100 years. Now, I want to mention one thing, is that I promise every one of you, Ashkenazi or Sephardi, have some degree of Iberian ancestry. Okay, this is an absolute certainty, so you can lay that to rest. The Jewish, if we have 600 lineages today, and there are 100 of them are Ashkenazi, and they descend from the same gene pool as the Sephardi Jews, you go back 500 years, you're looking at 500,000 ancestors, okay? Which was just about the size, and if you go back 1,000 years to the founding of the Ashkenazi population, you're looking at well over, millions of ancestors, maybe 1 billion. Basically, all of us are descended from every Jew who was alive at the time of the founding of the Ashkenazi population anywhere in the Mediterranean basin. So what we're trying to do is untangle it. Okay, we are cousins many, many, many times over, whether you're Mizrahi, Ashkenazi, or Sephardi. We're simply trying to trace genealogically and from a migratory standpoint where we all come from.
So I apologize to all those who've asked multiple questions. We only have time for 2 more before we pass it back to Ton and David. But I wanted to get some people who haven't had an opportunity yet to ask. So Monique and Daniel asks, there's mobility in the Sephardic Y DNA too, right? In a response to a family results, you said it was of Iberian origin with matches from what we previously thought were disconnected lineages. Are you finding uncommon ancestral Jewish lineages among those disparate ones?
Yes, we are, and that's the only way to find the common lineages is. So, I want to mention to you that the standard practice for Y DNA testing, and I didn't discuss this, and I should have, has been to look at something called short tandem repeats, STRs, which is what most of you who have done Y DNA testing have looked at. And when Family Tree DNA began testing, and when Karl Skoretsky did his article about the Kohanim 25 years ago, he looked, I think, at 12 locations. Then they looked at 25, 37, 67, 111. Now they're up to 700 locations. This is a very useful test, but the problem with it is that these mutations, just like they vary between two brothers, they tend to converge back together again over time. So they confound our efforts to time them and to branch them because of this return to the mean. On the other hand, the new form of testing that we're now using called next generation sequencing, where we're looking at 7 million locations, these variations are a one-way gate. Once you have the variation, in only one case out of 1 million have we ever found a back mutation. So when we see that Michael Waas has 2 sons and one of them has a variation and the other one does not have a variation, we know till the end of time their male descendants will carry that variation. Using that knowledge, we can now create much more specific trees that are well timed. So I'll give you one example. I don't want to hold you guys up, but the lineage I showed you a moment ago, where we showed a Judean lineage from 2,800 years ago that branched all the way from Afghanistan to Morocco. Until a month ago, we had no idea they were all connected to each other. We had no way of proving it, okay? We had a family tradition and we had general evidence of it, but by running 25 of these big Y tests, it's a very expensive test, but this is an important study. We proved uncontrovertibly that all these men came from the same Judean ancestor who lived in temple times. Okay, so this is the power of the test we can do. So the answer to your question is, we have not had the power to thread together these different lineages until relatively recently. And that's in addition to finding new people around the world to test. I want to make one other thing. I apologize for how dry this talk is, okay? I'm not used to not having people to talk to. And usually I'll ask you guys, in the course of giving this talk, I'll ask you a lot of questions and it'll be an interactive presentation. So my just talking to a screen like this is very unnerving. And I thank you for your patience and I apologize for how dry it all is. So Michael, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and our last question before I pass it back to Ton and David is from Daniel. He's asking, what is evidence that my group hasn't shown any mutation for 12,000 years, as we discussed? Can you talk about M319?
Well, M319 has had plenty of mutations in the last 12,000 years. The only way in which I would think it would not show a mutation if it was in a totally isolated population in the middle of Tibet and it never grew. But I'm going to have to look at M319, but I have never in my life seen a mutation from 12,000 years ago that shows no evidence of mutating. It should have, each 1,000 years, we should see at least 7 mutations. So 12,000 years, we should have at least 84 unique mutations to that lineage over the last 12,000 years. So I can't account for it. I want to mention one other thing. Michael and I love, and Wim as well, we love answering your questions offline. So you should feel free. There's no such thing as a stupid question, okay? We love answering them. So when you get off, you're welcome to send us emails. I'm Adam Brown at avotaynudna.org, or you can go to our Facebook. You can go to Sephardi Diaspora. We monitor it very closely. You can instant message us on Facebook. Michael Waas is on, Wim Penix is on, and I'm on. We're happy to answer questions.